Wyoming Territory, 1872. The silence was the first thing a man noticed, and the last thing he ever got used to. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air that pressed down on the vast, empty plains and settled deep in the bones. For Caleb Blackwood, the silence was an old companion, a familiar shroud he had wrapped around himself for 5 long years. It lived in the corners of his sparsely furnished ranch house, in the whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass, and in the hollow space in his chest where a different life used to be. He stood on the porch, a tin mug of coffee held loosely in his calloused hand, and watched the sun begin its slow, arduous climb over the jagged peaks of the Laramie Mountains. The light spilled across the valley in waves of pale gold and rose, painting the landscape with a beauty that felt both profound and utterly indifferent. It was a land that did not care for a man's sorrows. It simply was, and a man either learned to be a part of it or was broken by it. Caleb had chosen the former, sanding down his own edges until he fit into its harsh contours. His ranch was a testament to this philosophy. The house was solid, built of thick pine logs he had felled and shaped himself. The barn was sturdy, the fences were taut, and his small herd of cattle was hardy enough to withstand the brutal winters. Everything was functional, necessary, and stripped of sentiment. There were no flowers planted by the porch steps, no curtains in the windows, no echoes of laughter caught in the rafters. It was a fortress of solitude, and he was its willing prisoner. A distant plume of smoke, thin as a pencil line against the vast cerulean canvas of the sky, was the first herald. Then came the sound, a low moan that grew into a percussive chuffing, the rhythmic heartbeat of progress invading his sanctuary of silence. The twice-weekly train to Providence. It was an intrusion he had come to tolerate, a reminder of the world beyond his self-imposed exile, a world he had no desire to rejoin. He finished his coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to warm him against the morning chill. His duties as the town's reluctant sheriff would require him to ride in, to check the mail, to ensure the train's arrival and departure caused no more stir than the usual collection of dusty travelers and freight. It was a role he had accepted out of a sense of grim duty, not ambition. The tin star pinned to his leather vest felt heavier some days than others. Today, watching the iron horse snake its way closer, it felt like an anchor. He saddled his horse, Apollo, a powerful buckskin whose quiet companionship was the only kind Caleb could abide. The animal's movements were fluid and sure, a silent conversation between them that needed no words. As they rode towards the small, dusty cluster of buildings that constituted Providence, Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, his face a mask of stoic indifference. He had perfected the art of looking without seeing, of existing without feeling. It was the only way he knew how to survive the memories that haunted the quiet hours of the night. The scent of lavender, the warmth of a small hand in his, the devastating finality of a fever. He had learned that attachments were brittle things, apt to shatter like glass against stone, and he had no intention of ever holding one again. A man survived alone. It was the first and last rule of the world he had built for himself. The train shrieked to a halt, a great sigh of steam and iron hissing into the dry air. Providence Station was little more than a wooden platform and a small office run by Jebediah, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and whose disposition was as dry as the dust that coated everything. Caleb dismounted, tying Apollo's reins to the hitching post in front of a sheriff's office, his gaze sweeping over the handful of people disembarking. The usual assortment, a few rough-looking prospectors, a tired-looking family heading further west, a salesman in a dusty bowler hat. Then he saw her. She stood as if she had been placed there by mistake, a delicate porcelain figure set down in a grimy workshop. Her dress was the color of a summer sky, a fine blue wool that was hopelessly impractical for the grit and grime of a frontier town. A small, elegant hat was perched atop a cascade of honey blonde hair, and her gloved hands clutched a leather reticule as if it were a lifeline. She looked lost, her wide, intelligent eyes scanning the small, expectant crowd with a hopeful anxiety that was slowly curdling into confusion. Caleb felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, an irritation he could not name. She did not belong here. She was a piece of a different world, a world of manicured lawns and polite society, of things he had long since buried. Her presence was a discordant note in the harsh symphony of his life, and he resented it. He turned away, intending to speak with Jebediah and be on his way, but her predicament was too stark to ignore. No one moved to greet her. The small crowd dispersed, leaving her standing alone on the platform, a solitary beacon of misplaced elegance. He saw Jebediah approach her, his expression a mixture of pity and bewilderment. Their conversation was too quiet for him to hear, but he could read the story in her posture. He saw the hopeful tilt of her head, the slight gesture she made with a letter in her hand, and then the slow, heartbreaking slump of her shoulders as Jebediah shook his head. The hope drained from her face, replaced by a dawning, quiet panic. Against every instinct that screamed at him to stay away, to maintain his distance, Caleb found his boots moving across the dusty street. He was the sheriff. It was his duty. That was the excuse he gave the silent, watchful part of himself. It was a thin and flimsy thing, but it was all he had. "Is there a problem, Jebediah?" Caleb's voice was low and rough, accustomed to disuse. The station master turned, his relief palpable. "Sheriff, glad you're here. This young lady, Miss Vance, she's come all the way from Philadelphia. Seems she was expecting to be met." Caleb's gaze fell upon her. Up close, he could see the faint smudges of travel on her high cheekbones and the weariness that shadowed her clear, green eyes. She held herself with a straight-backed pride that seemed to be all that was keeping her from collapsing. "Met by whom?" "A Mr. Albright," she said, her voice softer than he had expected, but with a clear, educated cadence that was as out of place as her attire. "He hired me as a governess for his children. He was to meet me here. This is Providence, is it not?" Caleb exchanged a look with Jebediah. "It is, ma'am," Jebediah said gently. "But I've been the station master here for 10 years. There's no family named Albright in this valley. Never has been." The last vestiges of her composure seemed to crumble, though her expression remained bravely neutral. Her gloved fingers tightened on the letter she held. "But the advertisement, the correspondence. He sent funds for my ticket." Caleb knew the cruel shape of this story. He had seen it before, though usually with men lured by false claims of gold or land. A heartless deception that left its victims stranded and destitute hundreds of miles from home. "Ma'am," he began, his tone more gruff than he intended, "it appears you've been misled." Alara Vance stared at him, the full weight of her situation settling upon her. She was alone in a strange, harsh place, with no one to meet her, no position waiting, and likely very little money. Her entire future had evaporated on a dusty train platform. For a moment, her eyes glistened, but she blinked back the tears with a ferocity that surprised him. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of these strangers. "I see," she said, the words barely a whisper. She looked around at the dusty street, the raw timber of the buildings, the vast, intimidating emptiness that stretched in every direction. It was as if she were seeing it for the first time, not as a destination, but as a trap. A gust of wind swept down the street, kicking up a swirl of dust and carrying the sharp chill of the high country. It tugged at her hat and whipped a strand of golden hair across her face. She shivered, and in that small, involuntary movement, Caleb saw a vulnerability that pierced through his carefully constructed armor. It reminded him of another woman, shivering in a winter draft, a memory he ruthlessly suppressed. "You can't stay here," he said, the words coming out as a command. He gestured toward the platform bench. "Jebediah, see to her trunk." "Ma'am, you'll come with me." Her head snapped up, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I will do no such thing. I do not know you, sir. I'm Sheriff Blackwood," he stated flatly, tapping the star on his vest. "The only law in this valley. And I'm telling you that a woman alone has no business standing on this platform with night coming on. You could take your chances at the saloon's boarding rooms, but I wouldn't advise it." where you can accept my help." Her gaze flickered from his badge to his face, a face carved from granite and shadowed by the brim of his hat. He saw the conflict within her, the battle between her ingrained sense of propriety and the terrifying reality of her circumstances. The wind blew again, colder this time, and it seemed to make the decision for her. She gave a small, stiff nod. "Very well, Sheriff. It seems I have little choice." He motioned for her to precede him. As she stepped down from the platform, her fine leather shoe, so ill-suited for the uneven ground, caught on a loose board. She gasped, stumbling forward, and he reacted without thinking. His hands shot out, closing around her upper arms to steady her. She fell against his chest, a soft, warm weight that sent a jolt through him, as sharp and stunning as a lightning strike. For a breathless moment, they stood frozen. He was acutely aware of the scent of lavender and soap that clung to her, a clean, feminine fragrance that was a ghost from a buried life. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs, or perhaps it was his own. Her face was tilted up to his, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, fear, yes, but also a flicker of startled awareness. The world seemed to shrink to the small space between them, the dust motes swirling like golden phantoms in the fading light. He released her as if she were on fire, taking a half step back. His hands felt strangely empty. "Watch your step," he grumbled, his voice harsher than ever to cover the tremor of that unexpected contact. "Thank you," she murmured, her cheeks flushed. She straightened her hat and smoothed her dress. Her composure a shield, she hastily reassembled. He turned away, leading the way to his horse without another word. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the charged memory of that brief, accidental intimacy. He had brought her under his protection, but in doing so, he had allowed a crack to form in the walls of his solitude. And he had the terrible, sinking feeling that the world he had so carefully constructed was about to come undone. The ride to his ranch was conducted in a taut silence. Alara sat behind him on Apollo, her hands resting hesitantly on his belt, her posture rigid. Caleb could feel the warmth of her presence at his back, a constant, unnerving pressure. He focused on the familiar rhythm of the horse's gait, the creak of the saddle leather, the vast, empty landscape unfolding before them. He tried to retreat into the familiar comfort of his own thoughts, but her presence was an undeniable fact, a disruption he could not ignore. She, for her part, was wrestling with a storm of emotions. Fear was the most prominent, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Everything she had believed to be true about her future had been a lie. She was adrift, utterly dependent on the charity of this grim, silent man. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of something else. When she had stumbled into him, she had felt the solid, unyielding strength of him, a sense of raw power held in careful check. There was an unexpected security in his presence, however taciturn and unwelcoming he might be. The ranch house appeared as the last of the sunlight bled from the sky, a dark shape huddled against the looming mountains. It was not what she had imagined. It was starker, more severe. As they dismounted, a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on an apron. She was older, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and a face that looked kind but uncompromising. "Caleb, I was beginning to worry," the woman said, her eyes immediately falling on Alara. Her eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "Martha, this is Miss Vance," Caleb said, his tone clipped. "She's been stranded. She'll be staying here for a few days, until the next stagecoach passes through." Martha's gaze softened as she took in Alara's travel-worn clothes and the exhaustion etched on her face. "Of course. Come inside, child. You look half frozen." She ushered Alara towards the house, her manner warm and practical. "Pay him no mind," she said in a low voice, jerking her head towards Caleb. His manners were lost somewhere on a battlefield years ago. The inside of the house was as Spartan as the outside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace. The furniture was heavy and dark, and the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something else, a deep, abiding loneliness. It was a man's space, devoid of any softening touch. "I'll prepare the guest room," Martha said. "You sit by the fire and get warm. I'll bring you some stew." Left alone with the sheriff, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Alara sat on the edge of a stiff wooden chair, her hands folded primly in her lap. Caleb remained standing by the door, his hat still on, as if he were a visitor in his own home. He seemed profoundly uncomfortable, his gaze fixed on the fire, anywhere but on her. I am grateful for your assistance, Sheriff," Alara said, breaking the quiet. "I do not know what I would have done." "It's temporary," he replied, not looking at her. "The stage to Cheyenne comes through on Thursday. You can find respectable work there. This is no place for you." His words were a dismissal, a clear statement that her presence was an imposition. A flare of pride, hot and sharp, rose in her. She was not some helpless creature to be shuffled along. "And what sort of place is this, Sheriff Blackwood?" she challenged, her voice gaining strength. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. "It's a place that takes things from people, Miss Vance. It's hard and unforgiving. It's not for delicate things." The condescension in his tone stung. "I may be from the East, Sheriff, but I assure you, I am not delicate." A flicker of something, surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect, passed through his eyes before the mask of indifference fell back into place. He gave a curt nod and turned away, moving to the fireplace to stoke the flames. The conversation was over. Later that evening, after a simple but hearty meal, Martha showed Alara to a small, clean room. The bed was narrow, the quilt was heavy, and the only decoration was a single, unadorned window that looked out into an ocean of darkness. The silence here was different from the silence in the main room. It was deeper, more absolute. Alara lay awake for a long time, listening to the sigh of the wind and the distant cry of a coyote, feeling smaller and more alone than she ever had in her life. She thought of the sheriff, a man who seemed to be carved from the same hard, unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. She had seen a crack in his armor, just for a moment, and she wondered what sorrows he had locked away behind that stony facade. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Alara, determined not to be a burden, insisted on helping Martha with the household chores. She learned to knead bread, her soft hands unused to the strenuous work. She helped mend linens, her fine, even stitches a stark contrast to Martha's practical ones. She found a quiet competence in the simple, repetitive tasks, a way to keep her mind from dwelling on the bleakness of her future. Caleb remained a distant, brooding presence. He was gone from dawn until dusk, tending to his ranch or his duties in town. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, cleaning his rifle or repairing a piece of tack, speaking only when spoken to. His silence was a wall, and Alara found herself inexplicably wanting to see what was on the other side. One evening, a cold rain began to fall, tapping a relentless rhythm on the roof. The sound seemed to amplify the quiet inside the house. Caleb sat staring into the flames, his expression darker than usual. Alara sat across from him, a book she had found on a small shelf lying open but unread in her lap. "Does the rain remind you of something?" she asked softly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. He started, as if pulled from a great depth. He looked at her, and for a moment the wall was gone. His eyes were filled with a raw, unguarded pain that made her breath catch in her throat. "It reminds me of a time when I failed to keep someone safe," he said, his voice a low rasp. The confession, so stark and unexpected, hung in the air between them. Alara felt a profound sense of trespass, but also a deep, aching empathy. She knew what it was to be haunted by loss. "My parents died in a cholera outbreak 2 years ago," she heard herself say, the words spilling into the quiet space he had created. "It rained for a week straight. The whole city of Philadelphia felt like it was weeping. I was supposed to be with them on a trip to the countryside, but I had a summer cold. The doctor insisted I stay home. I hated that cold for saving me." She had never spoken of this to anyone, not with such honesty. She looked at Caleb and saw that he was truly seeing her for the first time, not as an inconvenience or a delicate Easterner, but as someone who also understood the geography of grief. "I was a soldier," he said, his gaze returning to the fire. "After the war, I thought the killing was done. I brought my wife, Sarah, out here. We were going to build a life. We had a daughter, Lily." He spoke the names as if they were fragile relics, easily broken. There was a fever that swept through the valley one winter. The snow was so deep, the doctor couldn't get through from Cheyenne. I was the sheriff then, too. I was in town, helping a family whose roof had collapsed. By the time I got home, he trailed off, his jaw tight. The rain sounds like the dirt hitting the coffin lids. The raw agony in his voice was a physical thing. Alara's heart broke for him, for the man he must have been before the world had taken everything from him. In that moment, by the flickering firelight, surrounded by the sound of the rain, they were not a sheriff and a stranded governess. They were two survivors, two lonely souls who had shared the cartography of their deepest wounds. She did not offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She knew they would be useless. Instead, she simply met his gaze and held it, offering a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a shared understanding that was more powerful than any words. He looked at her, his stormy eyes searching her face, and he saw not pity, but strength. He saw a resilience that mirrored his own, albeit of a different kind. He had told himself that attachments were a weakness, but in sharing his deepest sorrow with this woman, he did not feel weaker. He felt seen. The silence that returned was no longer strained or uncomfortable. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that had forged the first tentative bond between them. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Blackwood did not feel entirely alone. The following morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of damp earth and pine. The fragile truce forged in the firelight held. There was a new awareness between them, a quiet respect that had replaced the initial tension. Caleb found himself watching Alara as she moved about the kitchen, her movements now more confident and sure. He saw not a helpless city woman, but a person of remarkable fortitude, adapting to a world that should have broken her. That afternoon, he found her in the small vegetable garden Martha kept behind the house. She was on her knees, carefully weeding a row of carrots, her brow furrowed in concentration. The sleeves of her simple calico dress were rolled up to her elbows, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked up as he approached, and a small, hesitant smile touched her lips. "I hope you do not mind," she said. Martha said the weeds were getting ahead of her. "It's fine," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking its former edge. He leaned against the fence post, watching her work. "You seem to have a knack for it." "My mother loved her garden," Alara replied, her voice soft with memory. She said that tending to living things was a way of tending to one's own soul. She looked down at the rich soil clinging to her fingers. "I think I'm beginning to understand what she meant." An idea took root in Caleb's mind, an impulse he would have dismissed a day ago. "There's more to surviving out here than weeding a garden," he said abruptly. "Come with me." He led her to the barn, the air inside cool and smelling of hay and horses. From a locked cabinet, he took out a Winchester rifle, its wooden stock worn smooth with use. He yelled out to her. Her eyes widened. I have never held a firearm before. Everyone in this valley needs to know how to use one," he said, his tone practical and serious. "It's not a toy. It's a tool. A dangerous one. But sometimes it's the only thing that stands between living and dying." He spent the next hour teaching her. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to load the cartridges, how to sight down the barrel. His hands brushed against hers as he adjusted her grip, and each time, a spark of electricity passed between them. He was patient and methodical, his voice a low murmur as he explained the mechanics of the weapon. He was a natural teacher, and Alara was a surprisingly apt pupil. She listened intently, her brow creased in concentration, her initial fear replaced by a focused determination. He set up a few empty tins on a fence post 50 yards away. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Squeeze the trigger." Don't pull it. She took a deep breath, lined up the sight, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a deafening crack, and she staggered back a step, startled by the force of it. The tin can remained untouched. A wry smile touched Caleb's lips, the first genuine smile she had ever seen on his face. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been. "A bit high," he said. "Try again. Remember to breathe." She reloaded, her movements more certain this time. She took another breath, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck the dirt just below the target. She tried a third time, and with a satisfying ping, one of the tins flew off the fence post. A triumphant laugh escaped her, a sound of pure, unadulterated delight. "I did it." Caleb's smile widened. "You did." He watched her, her face flushed with success, her eyes sparkling, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He was showing her how to be strong, how to survive in his world. And in doing so, he was beginning to feel alive in it again himself. Their shared lessons became a quiet ritual over the next few days. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to distinguish the call of a hawk from that of an eagle. And she, in turn, taught him things without even realizing it. She brought conversation back to his dinner table, filling the silence with observations about the landscape, with questions about his life, with stories from her own. She coaxed Martha into sharing old family recipes, and the scent of baking bread and cinnamon began to permeate the house, chasing away the ghosts of loneliness. The day before she was scheduled to leave on the stagecoach, a palpable tension settled over the ranch. The easy companionship they had built felt fragile, threatened by the impending separation. Alara found her heart heavy at the thought of leaving this place, which had so unexpectedly begun to feel like a sanctuary. She was even more dismayed to realize that it was the thought of leaving Caleb that caused her the most pain. Caleb was quieter than ever, his brooding silence having returned with a vengeance. He was wrestling with a conflict that tore him in two. His mind, the cold, logical part of him that had kept him safe for 5 years, screamed that he had to let her go. She was a reminder of everything he had lost, a vulnerability he could not afford. She deserved a life in a civilized place like Cheyenne, a life of comfort and safety, not the harsh, dangerous existence he could offer. But his heart, a part of him he had thought long dead, ached at the prospect of her absence. The house would be silent again, the loneliness would return, deeper and more profound than before, now that he knew what it was like to have it filled. That afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. Caleb saw them from the barn, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. Strangers were rarely a good sign. He watched as they rode directly towards the house, their posture arrogant and entitled. One was a large, brutish man with a florid face. The other was thin and weaselly, with shifty eyes. He met them in the yard, positioning himself between them and the house where Alara and Martha were. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. The large man spat a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boot. "We're looking for the sheriff. We hear he's taken in some stray." His eyes flickered towards the house, a greasy smile spreading across his face. Caleb's body went rigid. "I'm the sheriff. State your business and be on your way." "Our business is with Mr. Silas Croft," the thin man said. "He's a reasonable man. He's made you a fair offer for this land more than once. The water rights alone are worth a fortune." "The land is not for sale," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "I've told him that. He's not a man who likes to be told no," the large man sneered. "He wants this valley, and he's not partial to squatters and their female companions getting in the way. He just wanted us to deliver that message, and to let you know he'll be back to collect what's his." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of menace in their wake. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment, a cold fury rising within him. Silas Croft was a wealthy land baron from the east who had been buying up property all over the territory, using intimidation and violence when money failed. Caleb had known Croft wanted his land, It had the only year-round spring in the entire valley, but he had not realized how far the man was willing to go. And now, Alara was in the middle of it. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. Her presence here was not just a vulnerability for him. It was a danger to her. Croft's men had seen her. They would see her as a weakness, a lever to use against him. His decision was made in that instant, cold and hard and absolute. He had to get her away, not just for her own good, but to protect her from the violence that was coming his way. He strode into the house, his face a thunderous mask. Alara looked up from the table where she was shelling peas, her smile fading as she saw his expression. "Pack your things," he said, the words clipped and devoid of emotion. "I'm taking you to town now. The stage leaves at dawn. You'll stay at the hotel tonight." Alara stared at him, bewildered. "But I thought I was leaving tomorrow morning." "The plan has changed," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He could not tell her about Croft. It would only frighten her, and he could not bear to see fear for him in her eyes. He had to sever the connection cleanly, for her own safety. He had to make her want to leave. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "What has happened?" "Nothing has happened," he lied, turning away from her so she could not see the conflict in his eyes. "I've simply decided it's for the best. This is not a life for you. You need to go to Cheyenne and forget this place. Forget me." Each word was a stone he threw at the fragile structure they had built between them. He saw the hurt and confusion in her eyes, and it nearly broke him. But he held firm, retreating behind the cold, impenetrable wall of the man he used to be. This was a kindness, he told himself. A cruel, necessary kindness. She stood up, her dignity a fragile shield. "I see," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was mistaken then. I thought we had become friends." "Friendship is a luxury I can't afford, Miss Vance," he said coldly. "I gave you shelter. Now it's time for you to go." Without another word, she turned and walked to her room. Caleb stood in the middle of the kitchen, the silence ringing in his ears. Martha, who had witnessed the entire exchange, looked at him with an expression of profound disappointment. "You're a fool, Caleb Blackwood," she said quietly, and then she too left him alone. He was a fool. He knew it, but he was a fool who was trying to keep her safe. It was the only thing that mattered. He would endure the silence again. He would endure the loneliness. He would endure it all as long as she was out of harm's way. He pushed down the searing pain in his chest and went to saddle the horses, his heart a cold, heavy lump of lead. The ride into Providence was the longest of his life. Alara sat stiffly on the horse he had procured for her, her back ramrod straight, her face turned away from him. The silence between them was a chasm, filled with unspoken words and wounded feelings. He wanted to explain, to tell her about Silas Croft, to make her understand that he was pushing her away only to protect her. But he couldn't. To do so would be to admit she had become important to him, and that was a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. It would tie her to him, to his fight, and that was the last thing he wanted. He left her at the town's only hotel, a modest two-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Gable. He paid for her room and her stagecoach ticket, his movements brisk and impersonal. He handed her the ticket, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. She flinched as if burned. "The stage leaves at 6, he said, his voice flat. "Be ready." She looked at him then, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, her expression a mixture of hurt and defiance. "Do not worry, Sheriff. I will not be a burden to you any longer." She turned and walked into the hotel without a backward glance. Caleb stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching the door swing shut behind her. He had done it. She was safe. She was out of his life. He had won, but it felt, more than anything, like the most profound loss he had ever known. He spent the rest of the evening in his office, the small, cramped room feeling more like a cage than ever before. He stared at the paperwork on his desk, the words blurring into meaningless shapes. He couldn't stop seeing her face, the wounded look in her eyes. He had protected her body, but had been careless with her heart. And he admitted to the silent, accusing darkness with his own. As night fell, a deep, primal instinct began to stir within him. The visit from Croft's men had been a warning, but it had also been a probe. They were testing his resolve, and they would not wait long to act. An old soldier's intuition told him that the attack would come soon. They would assume he was alone, that the woman was gone, that he was vulnerable. They would come for his land, for his water, and they would come tonight. A sudden, sickening realization washed over him. Alara was not safe in town. The hotel was a flimsy wooden structure, easily breached. Croft's men knew she was there. What if they thought to use her as leverage? What if they went for her first? The thought was a shard of ice in his gut. He had moved her from the relative fortress of his ranch into the most vulnerable position possible. In his desperate attempt to protect her, he had led her straight into the path of danger. He was on his feet in an instant, his chair crashing to the floor. He had to get back to her. He had to get her out of that hotel and back to the ranch, where he could defend her properly. He strapped on his gun belt, checked his rifle, and burst out of the office, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The fool, Martha had called him. He had never been more of a fool than he was tonight. He ran the short distance to the hotel, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He didn't bother to knock, simply turning the knob on her door. It was unlocked. He pushed it open, his pistol drawn. The room was empty. For a terrifying second, his blood ran cold. He thought he was too late. Then he saw it. A note propped up on the pillow of the neatly made bed. His name was written on the front in her elegant, flowing script. With trembling hands, he picked it up. Sheriff Blackwood. It began, "The formality is small, sharp blade in his heart. I cannot leave without settling my debt to you. You paid for my passage, for which I am grateful, but I cannot accept charity. I have left the last of my savings. A small sum I pray will be sufficient, with Mrs. Gable to give to you. I have also decided not to take the stage to Cheyenne. I will not be driven away. I have found that I am not as delicate as you believe. I will find my own way on my own terms. I am returning to the ranch to collect the few belongings I left behind. I will be gone before you return. Goodbye, Alara Vance." He read the words twice, a mixture of horror and a fierce, soaring pride filling him. She had refused to be broken. She had refused to run. She was stubborn and brave and foolish, and she was heading directly back into the heart of the danger. She was going back to the ranch, where Croft's men were likely heading right now. He didn't hesitate. He flew down the stairs and out into the night, untying Apollo with frantic haste. He swung into the saddle and urged the horse into a gallop, leaving the sleeping town behind. The wind whipped at his face, and the rhythmic pounding of the horse's hooves was a prayer in the darkness. "Let me be in time. Please, let me be in time." He rode not as a sheriff, not as a solitary rancher, but as a man who had finally admitted to himself what he stood to lose. And it was everything. Alara walked through the darkness, a single lantern casting a small, flickering pool of light around her. She had paid a boy at the livery stable a few coins to saddle the horse Caleb had left for her, her heart a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. She was terrified, but she was also filled with a strange, exhilarating sense of purpose. Caleb's cold dismissal had hurt her more than she could have imagined, but it had also ignited a spark of defiance within her. She would not be dismissed. She would not be sent away like a piece of unwanted luggage. She had survived the loss of her family, the deception that had brought her west, and the harshness of this new land. She would survive this, too. She had told herself she was just going back for her things, but she knew it was a lie. She was going back because the ranch and the two stoic, unlikely people who lived there had become the closest thing to a home she had known in years. She was going back because the thought of never seeing Caleb Blackwood again was an ache too profound to bear. As she approached the turnoff to the ranch, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Not one, but several moving fast. A prickle of fear ran down her spine. She quickly doused her lantern and guided her horse off the main path, into the shadow of a thicket of pines. She peered through the branches, her heart hammering against her ribs. 3 riders galloped past, their faces illuminated for a fleeting moment by the moonlight. She recognized the 2 men who had come to the ranch earlier, the brutish one and the weaselly one. The third man was older, dressed in a fine but dusty city coat, his face set in a cruel, determined line. It had to be Silas Croft. They were heading for the ranch, and their intentions were clearly not peaceful. They thought Caleb was alone. They were going to attack him. The fear for herself was instantly replaced by a wave of terror for him. She had to warn him. She urged her horse back onto the path, her mind racing. She was no match for them in a direct confrontation, but she had a head start. She pushed her horse harder, the animal sensing her urgency and stretching into a frantic run. She reached the ranch yard moments before Caleb, who thundered in behind her, his face a mask of grim relief and terror when he saw her. "Alara, what are you doing? Get in the house," he yelled, swinging down from Apollo. "They're coming," she gasped, her words tumbling out. "Croft and his men. I saw them on the trail. They're minutes behind me." There was no time for questions, no time for recriminations. The soldier in Caleb took over. "Martha!" he bellowed, shoving Alara towards the porch. "Bar the door and the windows. Get the spare rifle." He pulled his own Winchester from its saddle scabbard as Martha, her face pale but her hand steady, appeared at the door. Alara scrambled inside, her heart pounding. The comforting quiet of the house was gone, replaced by a tense, electric anticipation. Martha handed her the rifle Caleb had taught her to use. Its weight felt both terrifying and reassuring in her hands. "Stay away from the windows," Caleb commanded as he entered, quickly barring the heavy wooden door. "They'll try to draw our fire." The first gunshot shattered the night, the bullet thudding into the thick log wall of the house. The siege had begun. Caleb moved with a deadly economy of motion, a man in his element. He knelt by a window, peering through a small crack in the shutters, his rifle ready. "There are 3 of them," he said, his voice calm and steady. "They're using the barn and the fence line for cover." Another shot rang out, this time shattering a pane of glass in the kitchen window. Alara flinched, but she didn't scream. She looked at Martha, who was methodically loading cartridges into a spare pistol, her face a grim mask of determination. These people did not break. Alara took a deep breath, her own resolve hardening. She would not be the weak link. She would not be a delicate thing. "What can I do?" she asked Caleb, her voice low and clear. He glanced at her, surprised by her composure. He saw no hysteria in her eyes, only a fierce, focused readiness. "Stay down," he said, "and load this for me. When it's empty," he tossed her a box of cartridges. For what felt like an eternity, they were pinned down. Gunshots echoed in the night, punctuated by the splintering of wood and the shattering of glass. Caleb returned fire sparingly, expertly, making every shot count. He was not trying to kill them, not yet. He was trying to hold them off, to make them believe the fight was not worth the cost. "They're trying to get to the back of the house." Martha called from the kitchen. "I see them," Caleb muttered. He fired twice in quick succession, and a yelp of pain from the darkness told him he had found his mark. But Croft and his men were relentless. They were getting bolder, moving closer under the cover of darkness. A bullet tore through the wall, just inches from Caleb's head, showering him with splinters. "We need to give him another target," Caleb said, thinking fast. Something to divide their attention. An idea, born of desperation and courage, flashed in Alara's mind. "The lantern," she whispered. She remembered Caleb saying that fire was the most feared thing on the prairie. He looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. It was a risk, a terrible risk, but it might be their only chance. "The side window, in your room," he said. "It faces the hayloft in the barn. If you can throw it far enough." "I can," she said, her voice firm. He nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. It was a look of trust, of faith. "Be careful." She crawled on her hands and knees to her room, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo. She grabbed the oil lantern from the bedside table, her hands shaking as she lit the wick. She crept to the window, unlatched it, and pushed it open just a crack. She could see the dark shape of the barn, could hear the shouts of the men as they moved closer to the house. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she swung the lantern back and then hurled it with all her might. It sailed through the air in a fiery arc, a small, desperate comet in the night. It smashed against the wall of the barn, just below the open hayloft door. Oil and flames spattered against the dry wood. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a small tongue of orange flame licked up the side of the barn. It caught on a loose piece of hay, and then another, and in an instant, the entire hayloft erupted in a whoosh of fire. Fire! One of the men screamed in panic. The barn's on fire! The attack on the house faltered as two of the men scrambled to save their horses and tack. It was the opening Caleb needed. He took careful aim at the third man, Croft, who was momentarily silhouetted against the growing blaze. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, and Croft cried out, clutching his shoulder as he stumbled back into the darkness. The other two men, seeing their employer wounded and their cover turning into a raging inferno, lost their nerve. They dragged Croft onto a horse and galloped away into the night, a retreat of beaten cowards. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle and roar of the burning barn. The fight was over. Caleb sagged against the wall, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving him trembling and weak. He looked over at Alara, who was standing in the doorway of her room, her face pale and smudged with soot, her eyes wide. She had done it. Her courage, her quick thinking had saved them. He pushed himself off the wall, intending to go to her, to thank her, but a wave of dizziness washed over him. He looked down and saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, just below his ribs. He hadn't even felt the hit. "Caleb!" Alara cried out, rushing to his side as he staggered. She caught him as his knees buckled, her slight frame struggling to support his weight. "It's just a graze," he grunted, though the sharp, searing pain told him it was more than that. Together, she and Martha helped him to a chair. The fire outside cast a hellish, flickering light into the room. Alara, her hands shaking, gently tore open his shirt. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow along his side. It was bleeding badly. "Martha, get the whiskey and clean cloths," Alara commanded, her voice steady and sure, the panic replaced by a steely competence. She had seen her father, a physician, deal with wounds far worse than this. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with a tenderness that belied the urgency of the situation. Caleb gritted his teeth, hissing in pain as the alcohol stung, but his eyes never left her face. He watched her, this woman he had called delicate, this woman he had tried to send away, as she expertly bandaged his wound, her touch gentle but firm, her expression one of fierce concentration. When she was done, she sat back on her heels, her hands stained with his blood. The fire from the barn was beginning to die down, casting the room in shadow. They were alone, the silence punctuated only by their ragged breathing. He reached out, his hand covering hers. "Alara," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. She looked up, her green eyes luminous in the dim light, filled with a terrifying and beautiful vulnerability. She had faced down gunfire and fire, had saved his life, and now she looked as if she were about to shatter. "You should have let me go," she whispered, a single tear tracing a clean path through the soot on her cheek. "I almost got you killed." "No," he said, his grip on her hand tightening. "You saved me. Tonight, and every day since you arrived," he pulled her closer until she was kneeling before him, their faces inches apart. "I was a dead man walking, Alara, living in a tomb I built for myself. You brought life back into this house. You brought it back into me." The carefully constructed walls around his heart, breached by shared sorrow and now shattered by shared danger, crumbled into dust. The truth, raw and undeniable, poured out of him. "I tried to send you away because I was a coward," he confessed, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I saw what was happening, what I was feeling for you, and it terrified me. I lost everything I ever loved once before. I thought being alone was safer. I thought I could protect you by pushing you away. I was wrong. The most dangerous thing in my life is the thought of it without you." Her breath hitched, a soft, broken sound. She searched his face, his stormy eyes, and saw the truth of his words reflected there, raw and absolute. "Caleb," she breathed, her own heart, so long guarded and bruised, daring to hope. "I love you, Ilara Vance," he said, the words feeling both strange and profoundly right on his tongue. "I love your strength, and your courage, and the way you see the world. I was a fool to think I could live without you. Don't go to Cheyenne. Stay here, with me. Build a life with me." In the aftermath of violence and fear, in the quiet heart of the night, his confession was a promise of a new dawn. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, her tears finally falling freely, mingling with the soot and the blood and the ashes of their old, lonely lives. "Yes," she whispered into the space between them. "Oh, yes." The dawn broke, pale and serene, over a landscape scarred by the night's violence. The barn was a smoldering ruin, a black skeleton against the soft morning sky. But inside the house, a fragile peace had settled. Martha had quietly retired, leaving them to the privacy of their newfound world. Caleb, his side aching but his heart strangely light, had not let go of Ilara's hand. They had talked through the night, the words that had been locked away for so long, now flowing freely. They spoke of the future, not as a terrifying uncertainty, but as a shared path, a landscape to be explored together. As the first rays of sun streamed through the broken window, Caleb slowly got to his feet, pulling Ilara up with him. He led her to a small, dusty trunk in the corner of the room, one he hadn't opened in 5 years. He knelt and lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender, faint and ghostly, rose from within. He pushed aside a stack of yellowed letters and a baby's christening gown, his hand searching for a small, velvet-covered box. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside, nestled on faded satin, was a simple gold ring with a small, perfect sapphire. "It was my grandmother's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah. It's a symbol of the women of my family. Strong women. Women who build things and hold them together." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "I can think of no one more worthy of wearing it than you. Ilara Vance, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked from the ring to his earnest, hopeful face. This was real. This was happening. After a lifetime of uncertainty, of being adrift, she had found her harbor. She had found her home. "Yes, Caleb Blackwood," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He rose and drew her into his arms, his kiss gentle at first, then deepening with all the pent-up longing and relief of a man who had come back from the dead. Later that day, a posse from town, alerted by the sight of the smoke, rode up to the ranch. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Pat, took Caleb's report with a grim nod. The story of the attack, and of Ilara's bravery, spread through Providence like a wildfire. Silas Croft and his men were apprehended a day later, their guilt sealed by Croft's own bullet wound. The town, which had initially viewed Ilara with suspicion, a strange and fancy bird of paradise, now saw her with a newfound respect. She was not just the sheriff's intended. She was a woman of substance, a true pioneer. When Caleb and Ilara were married a week later, in a simple ceremony on the porch of the ranch house, the entire town seemed to turn out. They brought pies and fresh-baked bread, offered help rebuilding the barn, and welcomed Ilara into the fold not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The community, which Caleb had held at arm's length for so long, rallied around them. The men of Providence, in a single weekend, helped him raise the frame of a new, larger barn. The women, led by Martha, helped Ilara make the house a true home, sewing curtains for the windows, planting a hardy flower garden by the porch, and filling the lonely rooms with warmth and laughter. Caleb, watching Ilara direct a group of women planting rose bushes, felt a sense of peace settle over him that he had thought was lost to him forever. He had believed that love and attachment were vulnerabilities, weaknesses that could be exploited, but he had been wrong. They were a fortress. The love he shared with Ilara, the respect of his neighbors, the community they were building. This was the truest form of strength, a bulwark against the harshness of the world. He was no longer a solitary man against the wilderness. He was a husband, a neighbor, a part of something larger than himself. And he had never felt stronger. 2 years later, the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the valley. The new barn stood proud and strong, its weatherwood a testament to resilience and community. The ranch house had a new wing, and the laughter of a child could be heard from a porch. Alara sat in a rocking chair, a sturdy, dark-haired toddler in her lap. Little Samuel, named for her father, babbled happily, pointing a chubby finger at a butterfly dancing over the rose bushes that now bloomed in profusion along the porch railing. Alara, her belly swollen with her second child, smiled, her heart full to bursting. The refined woman from Philadelphia was gone, replaced by a confident, capable rancher's wife, her hands no longer soft but strong, her spirit no longer adrift but anchored. She saw Caleb walking up from the newly irrigated fields, his stride long and sure. He had filled out, the gaunt, haunted look long gone from his face, replaced by the quiet contentment of a man at peace with his world. He mounted the porch steps and leaned down to kiss her, his hand coming to rest on her belly, a gesture of gentle possession and profound love. "How are my pioneers?" he asked, his voice a low, warm rumble. "We are thriving," Alara said, leaning her head against his shoulder. Samuel reached up for his father, and Caleb swung the boy into his arms, holding him high. The child's delighted squeals echoed in the peaceful air. They stood together, a family, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The silence of the valley was no longer a weight, a shroud of loneliness. It was a peaceful quiet, filled with the hum of life, the promise of the future, and the steady, reassuring beat of their shared hearts. Caleb looked down at his wife, at the incredible woman who had ridden into his life on a cloud of dust and misplaced hope, and had proceeded to rebuild it from the ashes. He thought of the cold, empty man he had been, a prisoner of his own grief. He had believed survival meant solitude, but Alara had taught him the truth. "I'm glad you didn't go to Cheyenne," he said softly, his lips brushing against her hair. She smiled, her green eyes full of a love as vast and enduring as the landscape around them. "This is my home, Caleb," she whispered. "You are my home,